SPG with 6 barrels. The American M50 Ontos that sent the Vietnamese running. 1952. A testing range in Aberdeen, Maryland. Engineers from the Allis-Chalmers company are getting ready to show off their newest combat vehicle to United States Army brass. A small, squat self-propelled gun weighing under 9 tons looks almost like a toy next to the massive tanks around it. But bolted to its sides are 6 barrels of 106 mm recoilless rifles. The commander takes his position under the turret, lines up on an old brick wall 300 meters out, and pulls the trigger. All 6 guns go off at once. A monstrous boom rips through the air, and the scorching exhaust gases blasting out the back of the barrels slam into the space behind the vehicle with such force that the windows of nearby parked cars shatter. Where the brick wall stood, nothing. Just rubble. The observers in cover instinctively duck from the shockwave. Right then and there, it becomes clear that the American engineers have built something wild, a vehicle capable of unleashing the firepower of an entire artillery battery in a matter of seconds. The story of this unusual weapon began a year earlier, when a series of meetings took place at the Picatinny Arsenal and the tractor division of Allis-Chalmers to develop a new universal chassis for the Army. The military needed a light, cheap, and mobile platform that could be airlifted anywhere in the world. The Cold War was heating up, and American generals understood that future conflicts would demand lightning-fast responses in the most remote corners of the globe. Heavy tanks were great for large-scale battles in Europe, but completely useless if you couldn't get them to the fight in time. By late 1951, the engineers got the green light and started developing 5 different combat vehicle variants on a single chassis. The foundation for all of these was a light-tracked carrier designated T-55, designed to carry 6 people, including the driver. At the same time, a stretched version, the T-56, was built with an extra road wheel on each side, able to carry 10 troops. The soldiers sat inside facing each other along the hull sides. For quick dismounting, the designers included a large hatch with double flaps on the roof and double doors at the rear. However, Army leadership shot these carriers down, calling them too thinly armored and too cramped for infantry in full gear. So the engineers decided to turn the rejected chassis into a weapons carrier. First, they looked at the T-164 variant with 4 recoilless rifles, 2 on each side. This project never even made it past a wooden mock-up. Next came a more ambitious design, the T-167, calling for 8 guns, 4 per side. The barrels were supposed to be stacked in 3 tiers, with the 4th positioned a level lower. But the military called that many weapons overkill, and on top of that, there were concerns about ammunition supply and reload speed. On the opposite end of the spectrum was the T-166, carrying just 1 recoilless rifle. This vehicle stood apart from the others with a semicircular hatch on the left side of the roof to give access to the gun mounted on the right. Later on, this variant got a hydraulic mechanism that let the barrel be lowered onto the right side for quick replacement or ground-level use. 3 of these vehicles were built, but this variant got rejected too. Not enough punch. The sweet spot turned out to be the T-165 with 6 recoilless rifles, 3 on each side. This was the configuration the designers landed on as optimal, striking the right balance between firepower, ammo capacity, and overall size. After successful trials in 1953, production of an initial batch of 24 vehicles got the go-ahead. The self-propelled gun received the official designation M50, along with the catchy name Ontos, Greek for thing or something. But the designer's excitement was short-lived. After a round of field trials, the United States Army turned the M50 Ontos down, and the original order for 1,000 vehicles was scrapped. The reasons were both technical and political. Minimal armor, barely enough to protect the crew from shrapnel and small arms fire, made the vehicle extremely vulnerable on the battlefield. Its tall profile paired with a very cramped interior created serious discomfort for the crew and left very little room for ammunition. But beyond the technical shortcomings, Army leadership, particularly Chief of Staff General J. Lawton Collins, felt the Ontos didn't fit the Army's offensive doctrine and worried it would eat into procurement budgets for additional tanks. Army generals, used to powerful and well-protected tanks, simply couldn't figure out what to do with this strange, self-propelled gun with 6 barrels sticking out to the sides. But the M50 Ontos found an unexpected champion. The Marine Corps, which always had a different approach to warfare than the Army, saw in this vehicle exactly what they'd been looking for. The Marines needed a light, mobile, yet heavily armed vehicle to back up amphibious operations. In 1955, Marine Corps Command put in an order for 297 vehicles, and Allis-Chalmers jumped at the opportunity. By the end of 1957, every last vehicle had been delivered. The production M50 Ontos was a compact, clever piece of engineering where every design choice served one goal: shave off as much weight as possible while keeping the firepower intact. The hull was shaped like a truncated pyramid, topped with a small turret. The vehicle measured just 3.83 meters long, 2.59 meters wide, and stood 2.13 meters tall. Ground clearance was 37 centimeters, decent enough for off-road work. The hull was welded together from rolled homogeneous armor. The plates were just 13 millimeters thick all around, while the floor got only 6 millimeters of steel. The angled plates offered some added protection against heavy machine guns and shrapnel, but couldn't hold up against anything more serious. Then again, the designers had always bet on mobility and firepower over protection. Now the base T-55 carrier also doubled as a test bed for something completely new. An experimental hull was made from a titanium alloy containing 6% aluminum and 4% vanadium. This alloy was the most widely used among titanium alloys and had outstanding mechanical properties. Widely considered the strongest and most rigid available, the titanium armor matched the protection of steel at comparable thickness while cutting hull weight by 25%. However, working with titanium was a nightmare, and the cost was through the roof. So the experiment died there, and the production M50 Ontos kept its steel hull. The suspension on the M50 Ontos was designed so that none of its components ate into the fighting compartment. 4 road wheels on each side were connected through balance arms to torsion bars mounted on the outside of the hull. The drive sprockets sat at the front, a hallmark of American tank design. Each track was 508 millimeters wide. Combined with a combat weight of just 8,630 kilograms, that gave a ground pressure of only 0.36 kilograms per square centimeter. To put that in perspective, a Soviet T-55 medium tank had more than double that figure. What did that mean in practice? The Ontos could handle soft ground, swampy terrain, and even rice paddies where heavier vehicles would just sink and get stuck. The power plant was a 6-cylinder gasoline General Motors engine, putting out 145 horsepower, enough to push the vehicle to a top speed of 48 kilometers per hour on roads. The engine sat in the front right of the hull, with the driver's station to its left. A 178-liter fuel tank gave it a range of roughly 185 kilometers. The tank had a pretty unusual design. It wasn't rigid, but rubberized, with a tubular channel running through the center that let the left drive shaft transfer torque to the left drive sprocket. Later on, some vehicles were upgraded and redesignated HAMM 50A1 Ontos. The big change was a new 8-cylinder liquid-cooled Chrysler gasoline engine, putting out 180 horsepower. On top of the beefier engine, the upgraded vehicles got an improved transmission and updated periscopes and sights. According to some sources, 294 of the 297 vehicles produced went through this upgrade, though other records say only 176 were actually converted between 1963 and 1965. The The M50 Ontos' real ace in the hole was its armament, the whole reason the vehicle existed in the first place. 6 M40 recoilless rifles of 106 mm caliber were mounted on a special crossbar running through the turret on top of the hull. The guns were grouped in threes on each side and had their own numbering, starting with number 1, the leftmost when viewed from the rear, and going clockwise to number 6. The stress on the gun mount was so intense that crews had to periodically realign the guns, which would gradually sag over time. By the way, the official caliber of the M40 was actually 105 mm. But to avoid mix-ups with a previous failed recoilless rifle model, the paperwork artificially bumped it up by 1 mm. The gun itself was developed in the early 1950s and entered service with the United States military in 1953. It was built to take out fortified positions, enemy troops, and engage armored vehicles. Vertical traverse ranged from -10 to +20 degrees, while the turret could swing 40 degrees to either side. On the prototypes, horizontal traverse was limited to just 15 degrees left and right, but the military found that wasn't enough, and the issue got sorted out in the production model. The vehicle could fire single shots from any barrel or volleys, up to a simultaneous blast from all 6 guns. All the barrels could be taken off and used for ground firing, though guns number 2 and 5 were best suited for this, since they had an extra articulated periscopic optical sight. To help with aiming, barrels 2, 3, 4, and 5 were fitted with paired spotting rifles in .50 caliber. The ballistics of these spotting rifles roughly matched the trajectory of the main gun round, letting the gunner zero in on where the shot would land before pulling the trigger on the main weapon. The spotting rifles were operated remotely from inside the vehicle and fed from magazines loaded with tracer rounds that left a small white puff on impact. That gave the crew another reference point for dialing in their fire. The ammo supply for the spotting rifles was 480 rounds across all 4 barrels. Mounted in the center of the turret was a .30 caliber Browning M 1919 A4 machine gun. It could be fired from inside the vehicle using the interior fire controls, or used as a standalone weapon. For that, the gunner had to stand all the way up, pop open the hatch cover above his seat, and release the machine gun's mount. The standard ammo load was 1,000 rounds. The ammo types for the main guns included several warhead variants. The first was a Hesh round, a high-explosive squash head. This one worked by spreading the explosive charge across as wide an area of the armor as possible on impact. When it went off, deadly spall fragments would break away from the inner surface of the armor, killing crew members and wrecking internal equipment. The warhead weighed 9 kilograms, and the muzzle velocity hit 498 meters per second. The second type was a heat round, capable of punching through up to 380 millimeters of homogeneous armor. It used a perforated cartridge case with small holes that vented some of the propellant gases rearward through special nozzles, creating a reactive force that canceled out the recoil. The complete round weighed 16.7 kilograms, was just under a meter long, and had a muzzle velocity of about 500 meters per second. Effective firing range was 1,200 meters. Maximum range topped out at around 3,000 meters. The gun was meant for direct fire, but crews were also trained to shoot from defilade positions at targets beyond the gunner's line of sight. The M50 Ontos carried 18 rounds stored in 2 spots. The main stowage of 8 rounds was in the lower rear section, beneath the entry doors, secured by a special locking panel. Another 4 rounds were stored inside the vehicle to the right of the commander. Together with the 6 rounds already loaded in the guns, that made up the standard ammo load. In practice, though, crews came up with all kinds of tricks to squeeze in more. There were cases where the commander's seat was ripped out and extra rounds were stacked in the freed-up space. Even crazier, sometimes the driver's seat got pulled too. According to one veteran's account, this trick could bump the ammo count up to 48 rounds, with driving and firing done literally sitting on top of the shells. One interesting detail was the crew size and how they were arranged inside the M50 Ontos. The driver sat up front on the left side of the hull, with the engine to his right. The commander, who doubled as the weapons operator, sat on a seat beneath the turret and handled all the aiming and firing. The third crew member, the loader, was supposed to sit on the floor on a special cushion to the left of the commander. At least that was the plan on paper. In reality, given how insanely tight the fighting compartment was, the loader almost never stayed inside the vehicle. He either rode on top of the hull or tagged along in a truck or some other transport. To reload the guns, the loader had to hop out, manually load a round into each recoilless rifle, then back off to a safe distance and wait for the word to climb back in. In practice, crews often drove with the rear doors wide open, which let road dust and dirt pour into the fighting compartment. That habit is what earned the M50 Ontos its less than flattering nickname among the troops, the Pig. There was a project for a field modification that would have significantly enlarged the turret and cut the recoilless rifles down to just 2, letting the crew reload without ever leaving the vehicle. But this idea never got past the wooden mock-up stage. The M50 Ontos first showed up in a conflict zone back in 1958 during the Lebanon crisis. However, the vehicles never actually saw action at that time. Their real baptism of fire came only 7 years later. By that point, a lot of people had already started to wonder whether this thing would ever prove itself in actual combat. Most people, even those into military history, assume Vietnam was the M50 Ontos' first war. But that's not the case. The American self-propelled gun first opened fire on an enemy in the Dominican Republic, a small Caribbean nation torn apart by civil war. In April 1965, an armed uprising broke out there, and the United States sent in a limited military force, citing the protection of American citizens to keep the rebels from installing a pro-communist leader. The U.S. Navy delivered Marines, amphibious tracked carriers, M48 Patton tanks, and several M50 Ontos vehicles to the area of operations. By that point, the rebels had gotten their hands on some of the government forces' heavy weapons, including armored vehicles. Now, which country's tanks ended up in the Dominican Army? The answer might catch you off guard: Sweden and France. After World War II, the Dominican Republic had picked up a batch of 20 Swedish Landsverk L-60 light tanks, which stayed in service all the way until 2002. The rebels captured some of these vehicles and tried to use them against the Americans. Bad move. The M50 Ontos finally got its chance to show what it could do. One of the Swedish tanks was knocked out by a dead-on shot from its recoilless rifles. On April 29, 1965, an M50 Ontos and an M48 Patton tank from the 6th Marine Expeditionary Unit took on 2 Swedish light tanks operated by the rebels and destroyed them. 1 kill apiece. But the Swedish tanks weren't the only ones to fall to the American self-propelled gun. A French light tank also wound up in the M50 Ontos' crosshairs. This was a more modern machine, packing a 75mm gun and considered a serious threat. But the heat round from the American vehicle didn't give it a chance. The hit was so clean that it set off the ammunition inside, blowing the turret clean off. That wrapped up the M50 Ontos' combat run in the Dominican Republic, now Vietnam. By the time the war kicked off, the Marine Corps had 176 of these vehicles on hand. The rest of the originally ordered 297 had either been lost during training and everyday use, or were sitting in repair shops. The spare parts situation was dire since production of new vehicles had already wrapped up. Sometimes one vehicle had to be cannibalized, stripped for parts, just to keep several others running. The first M50 Ontos vehicles touched down in Vietnam in 1965, but their deployment immediately ran into an unexpected snag. Command slapped bizarre restrictions on using the vehicle's main armament. Loading the guns, let alone firing them, could only be done with sign-off from battalion-level leadership. Crews had to get on the radio, ask for permission, and sit tight until they got a response before they could even make their weapons ready. The rules were eventually loosened a bit, letting crews load the 106mm guns on their own, but they still couldn't pull the trigger at their own discretion. Only after some time were these rules finally dropped, and M50 Ontos crews were free to engage as the situation called for. However, in Vietnam, the vehicle never got to fill its original role as a tank killer. The reason was simple: the enemy barely had any armor. Massive tank battles like the ones on the fields of World War II simply didn't happen in the jungles of Southeast Asia. Offensive operations were built around infantry supported by mortars, artillery, and air power. Tank engagements did happen, but they were few and far between. Still, the M50 Ontos carved out a different role and made a real contribution to Marine Corps operations. Thanks to its incredibly low ground pressure and wide tracks, the vehicle could go where other armored vehicles would just get bogged down. Even the soft soil around the vast rice paddies was no problem. There were cases where the M50 Ontos was used to drag logs out to tanks stuck in swampy terrain, since it was the only vehicle that could move freely across the soft ground. Thanks to its compact size and lightweight, the vehicle could sneak right up to the front lines undetected and was used to knock out fortified enemy positions before backing up the advancing infantry. Of course, this came with its own downsides. The vehicle had a tendency to slide sideways on steep slopes, and sometimes it even flipped over completely, putting the crew in a serious bind. According to veterans, the M50 Ontos was brilliant at a task that might sound simple enough: wiping out enemy troops dug in among dense jungle. Conventional artillery shells and aerial bombs were way less effective in those conditions. The thick vegetation soaked up blast waves and flying shrapnel, cutting down the destructive punch of the munitions. And calling in air support wasn't always an option either. In situations like these, the Americans broke out a truly devastating round that deserves a mention of its own. Shortly after the vehicle entered service, the ammo lineup was expanded with an anti-personnel flechette round, commonly known as the beehive round. It was a thin-walled canister packed with roughly 9,600 steel flechettes, tiny 2-inch dart-like projectiles with stabilizing fins, each weighing about 13 grains or roughly 0.8 grams. A simultaneous volley from all 6 recoilless rifles firing this ammo sent out an expanding hemisphere of nearly 58,000 lethal darts. Sure, some of those flechettes got tangled up in the dense jungle foliage, but not all 58,000 of them. The M50 Ontos was also heavily used for base perimeter defense, sitting right on the defensive line as a kind of deterrent. According to veterans, North Vietnamese soldiers were genuinely terrified of this little vehicle with 6 barrels. Sure, it was easy enough to take out with an RPG, but a camouflaged M50 Ontos sitting in a fortified position was something the enemy took dead seriously. Most run-ins between North Vietnamese troops and the M50 Ontos in these situations were pure chance on the attacker's part. They simply had no idea the vehicle was there until it was too late. Worth noting separately, Operation De Soto, when several M50 Ontos vehicles were airlifted to the front by Sikorsky helicopters over a distance of roughly 40 kilometers. This was the only time in the vehicle's entire operational history that it was used the way it was originally meant to be, airlifted into action, aside from plenty of peacetime exercises. The most important chapter in the M50 Ontos' combat story was the Battle of Hue in 1968, during the famous Tet Offensive. Thanks to their mobility, the vehicles turned out to be less vulnerable in urban combat than the lumbering tanks, and their recoilless rifles could bring down just about any building where the enemy had dug in. But the M50 Ontos wasn't invincible. It fell victim to anti-tank rocket launchers too. Losses of both vehicles and men in these brutal battles were heavy. The vehicles served in Vietnam from early 1965 through mid-1969. The military kept the M50 Ontos going until it was physically impossible due to a complete lack of spare parts. Vehicles that had reached the end of their useful life were turned into stationary firing positions, dug into the ground, where they kept on serving as fixed gun emplacements. In May 1969, the remaining operational vehicles were loaded onto transport ships and sent back to the United States. After coming home, the Marine Corps scrapped the vehicles, destroying most of the hulls and gun mounts. Only a handful of surviving examples eventually found their way into museums and private collections. That's the story of the M50 Ontos, a vehicle the Army didn't want, but one that became one of the most feared weapons the Marines ever brought to a fight. If you found it interesting, hit that like button and share it with your friends. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new stories about the most unusual military vehicles from around the world, and drop a comment letting us know which combat vehicle you'd like to hear about next.